Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up this hour on The Political Correction, we're discussing the government's decision to fly asylum seekers to Rwanda, the Met Police's decision to hand both the Prime Minister and Chancellor fines for breaking lockdown rules, and we're joined by a former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. That plus plenty more after the latest news.
Good morning, it's coming up to 1 minute past 10. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. The Archbishop of Canterbury says government plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda cannot stand up to the judgment of God. In his Easter sermon at Canterbury Cathedral, Justin Welby said the decision does not match our values as a Christian country. He also accused the government of what he called subcontracting out our responsibilities. Home Secretary Priti Patel has, however, said other countries will follow the UK's blueprint. Founder of Conservatives Against Racism, Albi Amankona, told GB News he thinks the Archbishop shouldn't involve himself in politics.
Not the first time that the Archbishop has made political interventions. I always think sometimes he is known to overstep the mark politically, I would think. There are certainly people who would agree with his point that this is a moral issue and therefore it's right that the figurehead of a British institution makes a comment on it. But then also there are people who just want the Archbishop to stay out of politics, much like the Queen does.
The Ministry of Defence says Russia is still committed to ending Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic ambitions and asserting its own regional dominance. Officials say Russian forces are continuing to redeploy combat equipment from Belarus towards eastern Ukraine, including locations close to Kharkiv. Russian artillery continues to strike Ukrainian positions throughout the east of the country, with Russia expected to renew its offensive. Russia has told the last Ukrainian forces defending the besieged city of Mariupol their lives will be spared if they surrender. Moscow claims the steelworks is the only area of the city not under their control. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister says authorities have asked Russia to open humanitarian corridors, allowing civilians to leave Mariupol today, but an agreement has not been made. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine's defense of the city continues despite Russia's blockade.
The situation is certainly not improving on a daily basis. Our military is blocked, and with them, the wounded people are blocked. There are many dead. Unfortunately, there is a humanitarian catastrophe with a shortage of food, water, and no medications. However, the guys defend heroically. We're grateful to them for that. To be honest, there is no trust in the Russian negotiators about Mariupol.
President Zelensky. Prince Charles says it's profoundly moving to see the number of British people ready to invite Ukrainian refugees into their homes. In his Easter message, the Prince of Wales paid tribute to the 200,000 people who have registered for the government's Homes for Ukraine scheme so far. Prince Charles also said he has been heartbroken by the suffering experienced by innocent victims of conflict, forcing to seek shelter far from home. Fresh allegations are being made over the Prime Minister's conduct in the ongoing Partygate scandal. The Sunday Times claims that Boris Johnson led the celebrations at a leaving do for his former press chief during lockdown. Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, says if the latest reports are true, the Prime Minister's actions are indefensible. Mr Johnson is expected to update MPs when they return to the Commons on Tuesday. The Prime Minister will visit India next week in a bid to boost trade and defence partnerships. Boris Johnson will meet his Indian counterpart, Narendra Modi, in New Delhi to focus on deepening the security partnership between the two countries. He's also expected to use the trip to push forward trade negotiations launched earlier this year. A former health secretary says the government needs to act to prevent avoidable harm being caused to babies by an anti-epilepsy drug. Jeremy Hunt says sodium valproate is linked to deformities, autism and developmental delay in children when taken by mothers during pregnancy. NHS England says it's working to cut the use by women who can get pregnant by 50% next year. And the Duke and Duchess of Sussex have commended the bravery of the Ukrainian team during the opening ceremony of the Invictus Games. Speaking at the event, Meghan told the crowd, "Slava Ukraini," meaning glory to Ukraine. The couple then kissed before Harry delivered an emotional speech telling the Ukrainian competitors, "We stand with you." Harry says he hopes the event will show the world that it needs to do more.
Your bravery in choosing to come and for being here tonight cannot be overstated. You know we stand with you. The world is united with you, and still, you deserve more. And my hope is that this event, creates the opportunity and how we as a global community can better show up for you.
Well, this is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching GB News and this is the political correction. I'm Deanna Davison and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry. We are here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. Coming up this hour, the Archbishop of Canterbury wades into the government's decision to fly asylum seekers to Rwanda. Priti Patel calls her plan a major milestone, but Justin Welby says it's ungodly. This week saw Boris Johnson, his wife Carrie, and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak all receive fines for breaking lockdown rules. How politically damaging is this? And they're back. Extinction Rebellion are back out in force. Yesterday, they glued themselves to an oil tanker in central London. Do you support their cause or not? And as always, we want to hear from you here on the Political Correction. So if you want to get involved in the conversation, then email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the Political Correction. This week, the government announced plans to send some asylum seekers who arrive in the UK to live in Rwanda. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said countless lives would be saved with the implementation of the £120 million pilot scheme, adding it would break the business model of vile people smugglers. Single men arriving to the UK in boats and lorries would be the initial focus of the scheme. They'd be given a one-way ticket to the East African country, where they'd be processed and, if successful, have long-term accommodation. The proposals have proved to be extremely controversial, with Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer saying the scheme was unworkable, unethical and extortionate. Paul, this has proved to be a pretty controversial announcement. What did you make of it when you heard it this week?
I wasn't surprised, to be honest, because I think the current situation, Deanna, has become unsustainable with large numbers of mainly young, fit men arriving on our shores undocumented. And that isn't a situation that can go on. That's the reality of it. And I think if you speak to most members of the British public, they have been urging the government to get a grip of this situation for years, frankly, and it hasn't happened. And I think the view of most mainstream opinion in this country is, look, we are a tolerant country. We welcome immigrants. Immigrants have contributed an enormous amount over the years to our country, to our economy and so on. But there have to be rules and you have to have order in the system. And I think people's faith in the system has just been shaken because the system, frankly, is broken. So I wasn't terribly surprised that the government decided that this was the way forward. As I said, I think it's an imperfect solution so far as it is a solution at all. But what I say to people is, look, you've got to come up with an alternative. Simply saying that this is wrong without presenting your own alternative, I don't think really cuts it. And in the end, I would rather people go to a country like Rwanda to have their asylum applications processed and possibly to live if those applications are approved, rather than risking their lives trying to get to the UK across the channel, because I mean there's huge risks involved. We've already seen a number of people die by trying that method, and you have to cut the business model. You have to end the business model where people feel obliged to pay thousands of pounds to criminal traffickers who then benefit from it. So as I said, imperfect. My inner jury, if you like, is still out in terms of whether or not it's a long-term solution. But something has to be done, and this could be a step in the right direction.
Well, no, I agree. I mean, clearly strong action needs to be taken. The numbers we're seeing crossing the channel, and there's very dangerous crossings, of course, as you rightly said there. A number of people have sadly lost their lives on those crossings. And records so far show that just on Good Friday alone, 200 migrants crossed the channel there. I think one of the things that I'm finding interesting about the kind of critique that the government's facing is there seems to be no distinction there between kind of refugees and economic migrants in that criticism, almost a sort of implication that everyone coming here is a refugee seeking kind of a safe haven. And yet, surely France in itself is a safe country in which a refugee could rightly settle, right?
And that, I think, is why people are angry about the situation, because I think on the one hand, people say, look, you know, there are a number of conflicts arising in the world at the moment. I mean, not least Ukraine, obviously, which we're going to come on to talk about, but you've also had the situation in Syria, Afghanistan, you've got the situation in Yemen, Ethiopia, you've got Kurdish refugees. And I think the general view of people is, look, Britain needs to step up to the plate. Britain needs to do its bit in terms of accepting and welcoming people who are genuinely fleeing war and persecution and whose lives may be in danger. We've got a good history of that.
I think very few people disagree with that as well.
Very few people disagree with that. But as I said, they look at what's going on in terms of the Channel situation. And I think they think, look, this doesn't quite meet the criteria here, because what we're seeing is, you know, thousands of mainly young men coming from what is a safe and civilised country. And I think that's what people can't understand. France being one of the safest and most civilised countries on the planet. So when you hear talk, you know, people who are criticising the Rwanda scheme saying, look, we have to open our arms to people who are beyond desperate. Nobody flees France because they have to. Nobody flees France because they're fleeing persecution. And as I said, you know, if people see daily television pictures of thousands of not daily, but certainly over the course of a month, you will see, I think it was 28,000 last year, so you're seeing a couple of thousand every month. What people are crying out for is order and management of the system. And if they felt that that was taken care of, then I have no doubt that the majority of British people would say, yes, we should do our bit, we should take in these people. I'm also concerned, Deanna, at the way that the debate is painted in black and white. You know, there are no shades of grey. If you support the Rwanda deal, then you must hate migrants and you must dislike Johnny Foreigner and you must be xenophobic. It's almost as if there's no middle ground and no nuance in the debate, and there has to be. On the one hand, you know, we have to say yes, we need to do we need to take our share of responsibility for refugees, but on the other hand, we can't have an open border situation. We can't say let them all come. We can't accept everybody. If people are abusing the system, then we have to deal with it. And we also need to remember that there are some people who are trying to get into this country and are going through it the right way. You know, they're doing it by the book. And they would like to make their lives in Britain, and are probably looking at the current situation and thinking, well, why is it that I'm doing all what is necessary and being patient, but other people seem to be jumping the queue and trying to get to Britain by other unconventional methods? And I think it's really tragic in many respects that debate has been painted in black and white, because I think as a result of that, the whole topic of immigration now has just become a running sore again in British society. It's become a toxic debate. And the reason that's tragic is because we'd actually moved on from those days. You know, if you look at the 70s and the 80s, when you had the likes of the National Front on the march, and I think there were very serious issues of racism in the country. We got to a point where I think we'd improved race relations enormously. Immigration wasn't really a topic in political discourse. And then all of a sudden, I think in the early 2000s, particularly around the time of EU enlargement, suddenly it became a topic again. Not because Britain had suddenly become anti-immigrant, but because Britain just felt that there was no order within the system and the system was broken.
And of course, at that point, the Labour Party proposed a very similar scheme to this as well, didn't they?
Yeah, I think it was
2003 or 4,
2004, like I think, where the new Labour government at the time proposed a similar scheme involving Tanzania. don't recall there being much debate or objection to that at the time. But it seems now, anybody who raises any concerns about A, the level of immigration, or B, the method of people coming into the country is immediately dismissed as a bigot and as xenophobic, and someone who's espousing views that are not in keeping with Britain's traditions. And I think that's absolutely nonsense. And I think what it does is it disparages millions of good people in this country who would welcome refugees and are very happy to do so, but are being told and are being abused and being told that they're being hostile to foreigners simply because they're innately bigoted. I think that's completely wrong.
Yeah, no, completely agreed. Well, to discuss this a little bit further, we're now joined by the MP for Ipswich, Tom Hunt. Tom, you've been pretty vocal about this scheme on Twitter. We've heard from the Labour leader that he's saying this is just merely a distraction from Partygate, saying the scheme is unworkable, unethical and extortionate. What do you make of that?
Well, I think Starmer's accused the Prime Minister, anything the Prime Minister is doing which involves doing his job, as being a distraction technique. I seem to remember that Keir Starmer was saying the Prime Minister dealing with the Ukrainian situation, one of the biggest, arguably the biggest development on the European continent since the Second World War, was a distraction technique. This is apparently a distraction technique as well. No, this is just, it's actually, that in itself is a distraction technique from Keir Starmer, who, in my view, wants to deny the thing that we all know, which is that the Labour Party, as far as I can see, are anti any kind of immigration control, are an open borders party. And by all means, they should make the case and stand by why they believe that is the right thing to do. But I just think they should be honest to the British people.
Well, let's get away from the Labour Party and talk about the charity sector. There was an open letter that was signed by over 160 charities in the UK calling for the government to scrap these plans, saying in the letter, quote, "It's shamefully cruel." What do you make of that, and how would you respond to those charities?
Well, I mean, they're obviously quite clearly wrong, and they're quite clearly out of step with the majority of the British people, as is Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I think it's an incredibly wrong-headed position that they've got. I mean, they're wrong. We know they're wrong. They don't represent the views of the British people. Let's move on and crack on and sorting out this problem.
And how have your constituents responded to these plans? Because I don't know about you, I've had a fair few emails coming in.
But Deanna, you like me, you'll know your constituency, and you'll have your own ways of trying to read the mood of your constituents, which doesn't involve upon going off how small number of your constituents who tweet at you on Twitter and email you. So I mean, I've probably knocked on about 300, 400 doors over the last couple of days. The Rwanda deal has come up, and I think barring one person yesterday, everybody was supportive of it. So I think that's where the majority of the British people are. And when people say, oh, this is hugely controversial, well, it's hugely controversial within the Westminster bubble, and it's hugely controversial within the do-gooding sector. But actually, it's not hugely controversial for most fair-minded British people who, yes, want to welcome genuine refugees, yes, want us to be a country which is pro-immigration, but want to have control, because the key thing here is about control. We've taken control of legal immigration. We've got to take control of our asylum system as well. And actually, every single person who comes over from France, who is an economic migrant, who's able to stay here, it limits our ability to show compassion towards people coming from Ukraine, from Afghanistan. Because of the pressure it puts on public services, and of course in terms of the people who have lost their lives from the Channel as well. For every reason, this is the right thing to do. It's very regrettable that the Archbishop of Canterbury has decided to make the comments that he's made today. Today should be a day where we come together and we reflect, and it's a peaceful day. So for him just to wade into a complex political matter, and again got on the wrong side of public opinion, I think is bad for the Church of England. And I think it's bad for his own credibility. It's not the first time he's done it, and I think it's incredibly regrettable.
I think one thing that keeps coming up, Tom, is around the cost of this scheme. I mean, the Labour Party have said it's extortionate, but just looking at it, it's £120 million initially, plus then clearly there's going to be the ongoing costs of paying for the accommodation, paying for the actual flights out to Rwanda. How would you respond to criticism about that?
Well, in terms of the cost point, I mean, there's obviously a serious cost to the status quo. I mean, just outside, Ipswich, we've got 100 economic migrants being, in a 4-star hotel. I mean, how much does that cost? And also, with the numbers going up, it was 28,000 last year. It's predicted it could be about 50,000 this year. It's almost like a never-ending cost, and we don't know, and it's just escalating and escalating and escalating. The thing about what we're proposing is, yes, there is a significant cost up front, but hopefully the deterrent effect will mean that it can deal with the issue quite quickly. We saw with Australia, they had a massive problem with illegal immigration. They embraced offshore processing, and today they don't have a big problem with illegal immigration. The left will say, they tried it in Australia, it didn't work. It did work. It worked very, very well. It worked incredibly effectively. It worked so effectively that the Labour Party in Australia implemented it as well. It's very lazy for them to say, and some of them even said that Australia have stopped doing it. They haven't stopped doing it. They stopped doing it in Papua New Guinea. They're still doing it in the other island location. I forgot the name of it.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Well, Tom Hunt there, MP for Ipswich, on the government's plans to send migrants to Rwanda. Tom, thank you for joining us on the show this morning. Now, coming up after the break, we're discussing Partygate and the Met's decision to fine both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. But as always, we want to hear from you today, so please do get involved by emailing us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweeting us at gbnews. See you after the break.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. And as always, loads of you have been getting in touch. Oh, I love this one here. Lynn has said, I just turned on today and thought you had Prince Harry on with Deanna Davison. Paul looked great today.
Bless her, I wish I had his money. On Rwanda, Richard says, the Archbishop should stick to God-bothering. It's not up to the SNP either. How about the will of the vast majority of the British people who voted for border control at the last election?
Yeah, and a load of you getting in touch on this same story. Karen here saying, we cannot continue with the illegal migrants coming over. Something needs to be done. We've been too open-armed to all the refugees and legal asylum seekers. We can't take illegal asylum seekers too. The infrastructure benefit system is broken, plus what about our own needs? We need to start looking after our own vulnerable.
And James says, it's beyond my imagination how close media chase this story. What about cost of living and Partygate? Those are more important, domestic, and need to be looked at. If we cannot hold our leaders responsible to account, what is the point of having this democracy?
Well, James, I have good news for you, because the next story we are going to be moving on to right now is Partygate. Because this week, Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his wife Carrie and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak were all fined by the Metropolitan Police for breaking lockdown rules. It followed an investigation into parties that took place in Downing Street and Whitehall during the coronavirus pandemic. Both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have faced calls to resign, with Mark Drakeford, Nicola Sturgeon and Sir Keir Starmer all urging them to step down from their posts. Well, to delve deeper into this story, I'm delighted to say that Paul and I are joined in the studio by political commentator Stephen Wolfe, and down the line by Mail on Sunday commentator Dan Hodges. So, Stephen, I want to come to you first on this, because Initially, you were very critical of the Prime Minister, and now you're thinking that he should stay in post. Can you just explain why?
Yes, I mean, I've written an article. My article was saying that, he created the law, he broke the law. Many of us were expected to abide by that law. When they broke the law, they too were punished and fined for it. And as a consequence of that, naturally, and natural justice would have said that he and Rishi should have resigned. But then I took an analysis of previous prime ministers, like Tony Blair, who did something far more significant than that. And all these people that are now calling for Boris to resign, never were behind the idea that someone like Tony Blair or any other prime minister, when they've done something as dastardly as that, taken us to war illegally, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths. We talk about a migrant crisis now that is a consequence of those actions today. He didn't resign. And so here I am looking at that and listening to many, many of the people writing to me, uploading on my blog, saying we should have an element of forgiveness for this particular man. And here we are on Easter Sunday, and I've decided, yes, I think I should have some Christian forgiveness for him. And on this particular occasion, I've decided to swing the other way and actually say he should get on with the job, because there is a much more significant thing that he will fail on. And if he fails on that, the cost of living crisis, if he doesn't help us out in the poor of the areas that I grew up in the north of England, then that's the reason why he should go.
And Dan, you've come down on the other side of this argument, haven't you, with your piece that you wrote today in the Mail on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually think there's any ambiguity about this. I mean, Boris Johnson brought in rules and laws that were brought in to not just for an ad hoc reason or on a whim, but to protect ourselves, protect our country, protect our communities from a deadly virus. He said it was the biggest threat we had faced in decades, and he didn't abide by those rules himself. He's misled Parliament. I mean, it's quite clear he's misled Parliament, and obviously he's broken the criminal law. So we have a choice. We have a choice. We can decide. I know some people are saying, let's move on, but where are we going to move on to? We want to move on to a country where our leaders don't have to abide by the rules that they introduce to protect the country. Do we want to move on to a country where you can mislead Parliament with impunity? And do we want to move on to a country where our most senior leader, the Prime Minister, can break the criminal law and stay in office? And, quite clearly we shouldn't live in a country like that.
Isn't the problem, if I could just interject there, isn't the problem, Stephen, that he said to everybody else, you have to follow these rules, because if you don't, you're going to kill Granny, and those rules were extremely stringent, and people miss funerals, and they couldn't go to weddings, and they couldn't be alongside their dying loved ones, and so on. And the way I've kind of described it is, like, in normal circumstances, if a Prime Minister was caught doing 35 miles an hour in a 30 miles an hour zone and got a fixed penalty notice, most people really wouldn't give a fig, would they? Let's be honest. But had the Prime Minister in those circumstances given an almost nightly press conference telling the nation why they shouldn't drive at 35 miles an hour because, people are going to die, and then, potentially misled Parliament about the fact that he'd driven at 35 miles an hour, isn't it the hypocrisy that's going to get him in the end on this?
And this is why I supported the concept initially that I think he should go, because I remember very clearly my neighbour Norris, he'd been married to Pam, they were in my cottage next door to me. 62 years they were married together, and he died during the COVID period. And we were not allowed to have a funeral for him. We were only able to see his coffin at the bottom of the gate as the cortege went past. And at that time, I could have strangled anybody in government for not allowing us to be able to do the things that were naturally to human beings, bury their own dead. And certainly at those circumstances, he should have resigned, and so should Rishi, and so should most of the government, but so should Keir Starmer, so should the leader of the SNP. They have all broken the rules. And that is why I'm in this position. If none of them resign, if they don't all go together, then how can we just stand on one person say you should go? And that's the real hypocrisy, I think, Paul, is because none of them, they've all broken the rules. We saw it many, many times, and they should all go. But we've got a political class that won't move, and if they won't move, then we can't just single one out and say he should go. And that's where I've come to. They should all go or none at all.
Well, let's look at the kind of politics of this, because in the coming week in Parliament, there are going to be some pretty crucial votes there for the Prime Minister, aren't there? Dan, have you got a read yet of how you think those votes are going to go?
Well, I think, sorry, my cat's decided to join us. I think, well, you'll probably have a better view than you'll have a better knowledge than than I will on that. I think, obviously, there's been a perception that Boris is out of the woods on this issue, and I don't think he is. I mean, certainly speaking to the MPs I was speaking to over the weekend, the anger is mounting. And what you've got to remember is the threshold now for Boris facing a leadership challenge is lower, because there are about 40 names that have already gone in. Obviously, some people put letters in and some took them out again. But there are still quite a large number that are in. So I think Boris is still in a lot more trouble on this issue than is popularly perceived.
And do you expect anything to happen before local elections where all the polling's showing that we're probably going to get a bit of a drubbing?
Possibly. I mean, I think, as I said, I think the threshold is now so low. There is a possibility that something could be triggered. I would guess most people are going to wait and see how the local elections play out, see the reaction of the British people to that. But also, what we have to remember is this sort of Partygate is not occurring in isolation. It is occurring against a backdrop of the highest tax increases since the 1940s, the worst cost of living crisis since the 1950s. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, we hear is basically contemplating resigning on an almost daily basis. So the broader sort of political landscape for Boris is much, much worse than if this was simply Partygate happening in isolation, even though, as I said, Partygate of itself is quite clearly an issue over which he should resign.
Paul, I kind of want to come to you on this, because we've spoken about Partygate gosh knows how many times on this channel now. What have you made of how the Labour Party have handled it, knowing that, some of them, by the looks of things, haven't necessarily stuck to the rules themselves?
I think there's a broader debate about whether or not the stringency of lockdown was necessary in the first place. I mean, the truth is the Labour Party piled in behind it at the time. Anyone who expressed a dissenting voice was effectively shut down. And the reality is that the bill for lockdown is now starting to land, and it's a pretty hefty one in terms of people's health, in terms of the economy, etc., and the damage that was done to the economy. And I think that there needs to be a real debate about whether or not that was effective at the time, whether or not that was right. I mean, I'm not implicitly anti-lockdown. I think there's a call sometimes to say that a nation needs to lock down, but I think if you look at other countries, I don't think the evidence is stacked up in favour of lockdown. I think if you look at Sweden and Japan, for example, who took a more flexible view, they don't seem to have done much worse than us. So in many respects, the Labour Party has got to accept its share of responsibility for supporting something that I think has been pretty disastrous in many respects. And yes, it's not a party political point, because, across the board, parties supported this. And I think there's more than one person who needs to be held culpable.
Stephen, I saw you nodding away there.
Yes, I mean, I think what you've got is the political parties came together on lockdown. They've come together on Ukraine, and we're going to talk about other areas where they've come together. And so as a consequence of that, they all share the same burden and the same responsibilities. And that's why it's very important to consider that if they're attacking Boris on this, I don't see a difference between the event that Keir Starmer went to, whereas was it beers and pizzas? It's exactly the same scenario. And the public are looking at them, and they're all losing trust. My only thoughts about this is that historically Prime Ministers don't resign over a big crisis like this. What they do resign over is a failure in the polls. And so if the Conservative parties do get a massive drubbing in these local elections, as people are suggesting, then that will give certainly Boris an out to be able to resign on the basis that the party is no longer being looked upon as successful. And if he did so with the link into Partygate, then that would actually make him stand out in history as one of those prime ministers that took responsibility very seriously. If he doesn't, he'll just be like the rest, which is why I feel that there is this feeding into the political views of people that they can't trust our electorate. Our elected officials.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much there. Stephen Wolfe and Dan Hodges both joining us to talk about Partygate, the fact the Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak have been fined. Stay with us, send us your views. Coming up after the break, we'll be joined by a former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion to discuss their recent wave of protests in the country. But as always, we want to hear from you, so get involved. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @gbnews. See you after the break.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction, and as ever, lots of you getting in touch here. We've got views on Rwanda from Jeff, who says, we're told we're the fourth richest country in the world. We have a housing shortage and food banks continue to grow.
And on the same subject, Dean says, we've just given Ukraine millions to fund a war and it's creating more refugees. This government has no problem with that at all.
Rob here saying no one seems to raise the subject of the overall population density of the UK with all the problems it places on the environment. We need a sustainable population policy.
And on Partygate, John tells us, why are any police officers wasting their time chasing something that has been and gone? So
isn't that all crime, though, basically?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah, most crimes usually happened, I think, certainly when it's been investigated. But I can understand John's point. Sharon here saying, I just can't see how the Prime Minister can stay where he is. The world's laughing at us. And then Mark says, what is seriously concerning is how the PM and Chancellor has damaged the fabric of government and how the public will respond to future crises when they're asked to comply. I think a lack of trust and the complete absence of integrity in regards to what's happened in Number 10 could have very significant consequences for us all. The Conservative Party is better than this and we deserve better. Well, do keep your views coming in there on all the stories that we are discussing today. This week, Extinction Rebellion protesters blocked 4 of London's busiest bridges, calling for an end to new fossil fuel investments. The group, which describes itself as an international non-violent civil disobedience movement, carried out a week of demonstrations to highlight what they see as inaction on climate change from the UK government. Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng addressed the group via social media, tweeting, "You cannot and we won't switch off domestic oil and gas production." Just Stop Oil, a group affiliated with Extinction Rebellion, have continued their protests at oil terminals in the UK, where this week various arrests were made. Paul, on this, oh, that's all right. We've got our guest already lined up, joining us to discuss this. I'll come to you in a second, Paul. Is author and former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, Rupert Reed. Rupert, thank you for joining us this morning. I guess my main question is, what exactly is it that Extinction Rebellion want?
Well, I think what Extinction Rebellion want is they want to have an end to the absurdity of having more oil and more gas at a time when we ought to be having less and moving to renewable sources. I think that it makes overwhelming sense to people, this move. There was an opinion poll the other day that showed that between 70 and 90% of people in every country in the world thought we should be moving away from fossil fuels. So actually, Extinction Rebellion's opinion is pretty mainstream here.
I think if I was to go out and ask my constituents and people all over the country whether they think we should move towards green as an overall policy, I think there would be agreement. But I think the difficulty is when it gets down to the nitty-gritty detail, isn't it? Particularly when it comes to cost of living. And of course, we're seeing huge pressures at the moment on people's energy bills. We can't just turn on green overnight, can we?
Well, quite correct, which is why it's a shame that we didn't turn it on a long time ago. It's a great shame that the Conservative government 10 years ago effectively banned us from having more onshore wind, which is the cheapest source of energy now out of all sources of energy. So the first thing the government needs to do, which they haven't said they're going to do yet, is they need to put onshore wind back on the agenda. The other thing they need to do is they need to invest massively in energy efficiency. Did you know 1 in 3 lofts in the UK has no insulation? I mean, that is just completely crazy. That is an absolutely open goal. Why aren't the government walking through it?
Can you understand, though, why at the moment there is a move towards potentially fracking or releasing more oil and gas in the immediate kind of response to this crisis?
Yeah, so of course, in relation to the Ukraine crisis, we have to think intelligently, we have to think on a more or less emergency basis. But then again, on this point, it's absolutely clear that the way to go is onshore wind and the way to go is energy efficiency and reducing waste, because it's just far quicker than fracking or having new oil, which takes typically up to 8 years, 10 years to bring online. The other thing to bear in mind very carefully about oil and gas is that they are part of an international market. Unless you were to completely nationalize the oil and gas industry, there is absolutely no guarantee that gas that was extracted in this country would be used in this country. In fact, at the moment, a very high percentage of the gas that we extract in this country is sent abroad. And that would be the case also if fracking, heaven forfend, were to be reintroduced. In order to have electricity that is close to home, we ought to make it right here at home. We ought to make it via solar and via wind. And once again, I would remind you that the overwhelming majority of Britons agree with this point, and the most recent poll is over 80%. So this is a completely mainstream point of view saying, come on, it's 2022, we don't need more new oil and gas. And I think that the basic demand there of Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion is really very, very difficult to argue with.
Well, Rupert, sort of chatting to you here, it's a very kind of sensible discussion about what sort of steps potentially should be taken. But don't you think that some of the sort of steps like blockading roads, blockading oil tankers, do you not think that actually harms the cause rather than actually promoting some of this messaging about moving towards green?
Well, of course, the first thing to say about protests like these is they do get onto the news, and that's why I'm talking with you here this morning. The next thing I'd say is if any viewers are thinking something like, there's got to be a better way than blockading oil depots and sitting on oil tankers and stuff like that, then I would say, please knock yourselves out, go for it. The best thing to do in a crisis is to all muck in together. So don't just criticize, get on with it. What I would love to see is millions of people in this country taking action to green their workplaces, to green the places where they live. And you know what? If tens of millions of ordinary people in this country were to start pressuring government themselves to do the right thing and were to start doing the right thing themselves in the sense of working together to have the kind of future we need with more energy efficiency, with more loft insulation, etc., with more community wind power projects, then you know what? The young people, and it's overwhelmingly young people who get involved in these kinds of Just Stop Oil type protests, maybe they would have some faith that we're actually going to be on track, because right now we're completely off track. Remember that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for whom I'm an expert reviewer, have just said in their latest report, we need to make deep and immediate cuts in our oil and gas production, deep and immediate. Now, that is a very, very clear message. And if we want young people to have faith that we're going to do that, well, let's get on and do it.
Can we just talk very quickly about Just Stop Oil specifically? Because some of the kind of blockades that they've had in place and the protests that they're running, particularly in the sort of southeast and southwest, have caused absolute chaos for motorists struggling to access fuel, particularly on this Easter bank holiday weekend. Can you understand why there's so much anger amongst the population?
Absolutely, of course. And I think whenever anyone engages in this kind of protest, it's really a last resort. But, you know, coming back to the Ukraine context for this, what I would say is now it's a difficult thing to ask, but I would say to people, now is a good time to ask ourselves, is your journey really necessary? You know, the Prime Minister has said it's as if we're at war. Well, that's an old wartime slogan. The thing that Putin wants more than anything else is for us to use more oil and more gas and for us to be dependent upon international gas and oil markets. The thing he wants less than anything else is for us to use less energy, for us to use less oil, for us to have less energy waste, for us to be more energy self-sufficient in the energies of the future, which of course are green. So, you know, if you want to combine the thinking here on Putin and Ukraine on the one hand, with the climate crisis and what young people are desperately asking for on the other hand, then there's an obvious way to go. So I would say to people, try asking yourselves the question, is your journey really necessary? Or can we actually help the Ukrainian people and help our young people and help the future by actually using less gas and less oil starting now?
So, Rupert, I notice you're saying there people should ask themselves whether their journey is necessary. But I noticed this morning that you are actually in France. So I guess my question is, was your journey to France necessary?
So I came here to France by train for meetings with business people and employees about how we can create a future where we won't need to have so many Extinction Rebellion protests or Just Stop Oil protests, because everybody will be doing the right thing anyway in their workplaces. If, like I said earlier, if everybody starts doing the right thing, if everybody starts shaming our government, which is so woefully behind where it needs to be, if we all start creating a future where there will be less commuting, where there will be shorter supply lines, where we won't be buying products to throw them away, where there'll be less fast fashion, you name it, the list goes on and on. If we start co-creating that future, then actually we can have a future where there isn't going to be such a felt need for these kind of protests.
But is there a reason why your meeting couldn't take place on Zoom, Rupert? Surely that would have been the greenest way for you to kind of go about your aims there.
As I say, I travelled here by train, and sometimes I think it's really important to have meetings with people in person, because if you're not in person with people, sometimes you can't look them in the eye and close a deal. I'm sure you understand that.
Well, thank you there. Rupert Reed joining us, a former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. Now, Scotland is set to become the first part of the UK to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to stand for election. The SNP proposals would allow under 18s to become MSPs at the next Scottish Parliament election in 2026. The plans would mean someone in Scotland could, at the age of 16 or 17, serve their constituents at Holyrood whilst not being able to vote for their own MP, with the voting age for Westminster elections still being 18. Paul, what did you make of this?
I think it's a complete nonsense, frankly.
We're agreeing a lot today. It's scary.
We are. Yeah, let's put an end to that. I think it's gerrymandering, effectively. You know, people trying to appeal to 16-year-olds by suggesting they're imbued with some kind of innate wisdom and they should take their place in the legislature. I mean, there's a crossover between that, obviously, and the Votes at 16 campaign. And I'm just someone who thinks, look, obviously you don't dismiss the views of young people. Often they've got an insight that they can offer that older people don't have. But equally, let's not pretend that they are imbued with you know, the type of wisdom that other people don't have. 16-year-olds are not allowed to buy knives. They're not allowed to buy fireworks. They're not allowed to get married in England and Wales without permission. They're not allowed to go into combat or buy tobacco. So the idea to me that they can actually sit in a legislature and make laws just seems to me to be completely ridiculous. Some of these people may still be at school. And, you know, raise the prospect of somebody potentially getting detention for backchatting a teacher and then saying, well, I can't do the detention, sir, because I've got to be down to Parliament.
Or I can't make the vote because I've got detention, one or the other.
I mean, this seems to me to be one of those stories that is completely bonkers, and I suspect if you said to most people out there, is it a good idea, most people would say no. But the other aspect to it, I think, is it kind of ties in with this idea that older people don't really have much to offer anymore. And I think that this is an idea that took hold around the time of the Brexit referendum when, a majority of older people voted leave. And we saw some real nasty discourse around that. Older people were called gammon, and you even had some commentators calculating how long it would be before older people died off, and we were then outweighed by Remain voters. So that kind of nature of the debate, I think, is continuing in many respects. But actually, I think we should respect older people, understand that they've often got life experiences that younger people don't have. They know what it's like to be unemployed, to raise a family, to have to pay for a mortgage, all of these sorts of things. So I want to see young people involved in politics. But I
That's
don't
reassuring.
Well, yeah, so you're covered. But I don't want them making our laws.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on the point about, can't buy alcohol or tobacco, access certain establishments like casinos, like, for example. Surely we need a sort of standardised age at which one becomes an adult. And in the UK, we've pretty much settled on that being 18. So I think I share your view. I think this is a little bit cynical way to try and get kind of the youth vote, particularly if they can find candidates that, are kind of in that age group themselves, to kind of be sort of poster children for younger people they can look up to. But one of the things that I find quite worrying about this plan is actually thinking about my own experiences. And I'm, significantly older than that. I'm creeping scarily towards 30, which to me feels really old. But in the grand scheme of politics, it's still incredibly young. And I know the level of pressure that you face in these sort of roles, and it can be a very, very difficult job. Trying to put that level of pressure on a 16 or 17-year-old, I think, is actually pretty blooming inhumane.
Well, you need, as much as anybody, you need a thick skin in the game of politics. You need to be able to take robust criticism. You need to be able to, MPs get abuse, let's be blunt, there's a lot of that about. You need to go out and do media interviews. You need to field difficult questions. I tend to agree. I think it would be wrong morally to put a 16-year-old in that position. But the other point I would make is, what argument possibly would you then, if you supported the principle of people at 16 having either the vote or being able to become elected representatives, what argument would you then have against someone who said, well, it should be 15 or it should be 14? What logical argument would you have?
There was a campaign about votes at 12, I think, by our very own Tom Harwood, wasn't there, a few years ago?
And it's probably slightly tongue-in-cheek, but there's a perfectly legitimate point there. If you say 16, then why would you not say 14 or 12? You've got to, I think, in this country, allow people to vote, certainly allow them to stand for a parliament once they've accrued that life experience, once they're adults, once they're mature enough, emotionally as much as anything, to be able to withstand the pressure. So I suspect it won't come to fruition, but I hope it doesn't, because it's completely barking mad.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it will just create this horrendous disparity between the Scottish system and the Westminster system, as you say, with people at age 16 being able to stand for election to Holyrood but not actually able to vote for their own MP, which would just be complete madness, surely.
It would be lunacy, but there does seem to be, particularly the SNP and I would say the Lib Dems, the Greens and the Labour Party to a certain degree, who are more supportive of this idea. And the truth is, if we're honest about it, it's because they think they can sweep up most of those votes, because, let's be blunt, most 16 or 17-year-olds, if they were able to vote, probably would vote for more liberal, more left-wing parties. So from a purely cynical electoral point of view, as somebody on the left, part of me says, well, fine, let's get those millions of votes in. But if we're honest about it, it's a stupid idea, and we shouldn't entertain it.
There you go. You heard it here first. So much agreement between myself and Paul Embry here on the political correction today.
I'm winning you over, dear. Now you're getting.
I don't know about that. But do keep sending us your views. What do you think? Do you think 16 is too young for someone to stand for an elected position? Let us know on GBViews at gbnews.uk. An Islamic State fanatic has been found guilty of murdering Sir David Amess. On the 15th of October last year, the Southend West MP was tragically stabbed more than 20 times during a constituency surgery in Leigh-on-Sea in Essex. 26-year-old Ali Harbi Ali was convicted at the Old Bailey in just 18 minutes. Boris Johnson said earlier in the week that Sir David Amess was a beloved colleague public servant and a friend who championed the city of Southend in everything he did. The conviction comes on the same week as another man was jailed for 8 weeks for leaving abusive and threatening voicemails for Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner. Paul, I think one of the things that's so kind of difficult about cases like this is there's a lot of caution, isn't there, about the actual discussions that go on. So when the attack happened, of course, facts have to be established. Unfortunately, you did have a sort of branch of people who saw that the guy was from an ethnic minority and immediately jumped to a certain kind of conclusion. But then once those facts are established and, you know, we found that the guy was effectively an Islamic fundamentalist, some people are a bit afraid to talk about this, aren't they?
I think there are lots of people afraid to talk about it. I think the mainstream media is afraid to talk about it. I think members of parliament are afraid to talk about it. I think the commentariat generally are afraid to talk about it. It's like the truth that dare not speak its name. And we do need to talk about it. You know, we need to say what is driving certain people to commit these absolutely abominable and atrocious acts. And the truth is, on many occasions, they've been driven by their ideology. Now, okay, it might be a particularly warped version of that ideology, but it is nonetheless driven by ideology. And what was quite weird is in the immediate aftermath of Sir David's murder, that you saw people, including MPs, you know, saying, well, we need healthier debate in public life, and almost as if Sir David had been murdered as a result of nasty comments on Twitter or toxic political debate. Whereas actually he'd been murdered by someone with a particular fanatical ideology. And what struck me also is it was in contrast to what happened with the Jo Cox murder, where she was obviously murdered by a far-right terrorist. And the mainstream media and the commentariat were only too happy, quite rightly, to focus on that ideology. They put the ideology front and centre of the story, and it was on all the front pages, the fact that the man who murdered her was from the far right. Whereas when it came to Sir David, it was more a case of don't mention the fact that this man was a fundamentalist Muslim. Let's sing John Lennon songs and you know, be kinder to each other. So there's a certain amount of cowardice out there, I think, when it comes to Islamism generally, and that needs to be challenged.
Well, one of the things that did happen in the aftermath is there were calls for kind of greater protection for members of Parliament more broadly, because most people treat the job in a very kind of open and transparent way. You want to be there, very accessible to your constituents. You want to be in open surgeries, wandering through crowds and stuff. And I know from my perspective, there was this kind of instant wave of fear of, if this can happen to someone like Sir David, can it happen to any of us? And I think through the court case, we heard that actually Sir David wasn't Ali Harbi Ali's first target. He actually had visited constituency surgeries or homes of various other MPs. Do you think those calls for increased safety for MPs were the right ones?
I think they were inevitable and they were completely understandable. I would be concerned about anything that broke that fundamental link, that umbilical cord between the electors and their representatives. I think that is central to a functioning democracy. So you know, it would be, I think, a tragedy if we allowed incidents like that to end the constituency surgery system. You know, it's a sort of system that they don't have in America, for example, and is in many respects the envy of the world, because it does allow people like yourself to look eye to eye with your constituents, and they can tell you exactly what their problems are and the stresses and strains of their everyday lives. But equally, we need to protect people. You know, we can't have a situation where MPs are going to constituency surgeries unprotected, and things like this can happen. And I do think we need to look. MPs, as you know, come in for loads of criticism, sometimes quite rightly. But equally, we need to understand, and we're not very good at it in this country, that most MPs are decent people who are in politics because they want to make the country a better place, and often make quite a big personal sacrifice for doing that. And in Sir David Amess and Jo Cox's case, made the ultimate sacrifice. We should never forget that.
Yeah, no, I think you're quite right. And, you know, Sir David Amess's legacy, his work around animal rights, but also finally ensuring that Southend became a city after years of campaigning, I think is...
That was brilliant. And I was obviously formerly a representative for the Fire Brigades Union. We had a very close working relationship because he was the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fire Safety, and took a real keen interest in some of that stuff, worked very collaboratively with our union. So I know, you know, firsthand, you know, how diligent and passionate he was about the causes that moved him in Parliament.
Absolutely. Well, stay with us, because coming up after the break, we're joined by a human rights lawyer to discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine. And as it's Easter Sunday, we have an extra special Common Ground segment. As ever, we want to hear from you today, so please do get involved by emailing us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweeting us at gbnews.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up on the political correction, we're joined by a human rights lawyer to discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine. We discuss the Prime Minister and other cabinet members being banned from entering Russia. And as it's Easter Sunday, we're joined by not one, but two religious leaders, plus a special Easter message from our one and only Arlene Foster. All of that and more to come after the latest news.
Good morning, it's 1 minute past 11. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. The Archbishop of Canterbury says government plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda cannot stand up to the judgment of God. In his Easter sermon at Canterbury Cathedral, Justin Welby said the decision does not match our values as a Christian country. He also accused the government of subcontracting out our responsibilities. Home Secretary Priti Patel has, however, said other countries will follow the UK's blueprint. Founder of Conservatives Against Racism, Albi Amankona, told GB News he thinks the Archbishop shouldn't involve himself in politics.
Not the first time that the Archbishop has made political interventions. I always think sometimes he is known to overstep the mark politically, I would think. There are certainly people who would agree with his point that this is a moral issue and therefore it's right that the figurehead of a British institution makes a comment on it. But then also there are people who just want the Archbishop to stay out of politics, much like the Queen does.
Albi Amankona. The Ministry of Defence says Russia is still committed to ending Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic ambitions and asserting its own regional dominance. Officials say Russian forces are continuing to redeploy combat equipment from Belarus towards eastern Ukraine. It comes after the Kremlin announced the Prime Minister and 12 other cabinet ministers are barred from entering Russia. In his Easter address earlier, Boris Johnson praised what he called the courage of the Ukrainian people.
Those around the world facing fear of persecution, forced to celebrate their saviour's rebirth in secret. And of course, the Christians of Ukraine, whether they're marking Easter today or its Orthodox equivalent later this month, for whom Christ's message of hope, the triumph of life over death and good over evil, will resonate this year perhaps more than any other. Easter tells us that there is light beyond the darkness, that beyond the suffering lies redemption. And so, this Easter, будьте сильны и майте в сердце odvahu, вisi, что вповайте на Господа.
Boris Johnson. Russia has told the last Ukrainian forces defending the besieged city of Mariupol their lives will be spared if they surrender. Moscow claims the steelworks is now the only area of the city not under their control. Ukraine's deputy prime minister says authorities have asked Russia to open humanitarian corridors, allowing civilians to leave Mariupol today, but an agreement has not been made. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine's defence of the city continues despite Russia's blockade.
The situation is certainly not improving on a daily basis. Our military is blocked, and with them, the wounded people are blocked. There are many dead. Unfortunately, there is a humanitarian catastrophe with shortage of food, water, and no medications. However, the guys defend heroically. We're grateful to them for that. To be honest, there is no trust in the Russian negotiators about Mariupol.
Prince Charles says it's profoundly moving to see the number of British people ready to invite Ukrainian refugees into their homes. In his Easter message, the Prince of Wales paid tribute to the 200,000 people who have registered for the government's Homes for Ukraine scheme so far. Prince Charles also said he has been heartbroken by the suffering experienced by innocent victims of conflict forced to seek shelter far from home. Fresh allegations are being made over the Prime Minister's conduct in the ongoing Partygate scandal. The Sunday Times claims that Boris Johnson led the celebrations at a leaving do for his former press chief during lockdown. Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, says if the latest reports are true, the Prime Minister's actions are indefensible. Mr Johnson is expected to update MPs when they return to the Commons on Tuesday. The Prime Minister will visit India next week in a bid to boost trade and defence partnerships. Boris Johnson will meet his Indian counterpart, Narendra Modi, in New Delhi to focus on deepening the security partnership between the two countries. He's also expected to use the trip to push forward trade negotiations, which were launched earlier this year. And the Duke and Duchess of Sussex have commended the bravery of the Ukrainian team during the opening ceremony of the Invictus Games. Speaking at the event in The Hague, Meghan told the crowd Slava Ukraini, meaning glory to Ukraine. The couple then kissed before Harry delivered an emotional speech telling the Ukrainian competitors, "We stand with you." Harry says he hopes the event will show the world that it needs to do more.
Your bravery in choosing to come and for being here tonight cannot be overstated. You know we stand with you. The world is united with you, and still, you deserve more. And my hope is that this event, creates the opportunity and how we as a global community can better show up for you.
OK, this is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching GB News and this is the political correction. We're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you the people back in charge. Coming up this hour, we're joined in the studio by a human rights lawyer to discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine. It comes as President Zelensky warns that Russia could use nuclear weapons. We look at the Russian government's decision to ban the Prime Minister and other cabinet members from entering the country. And as it's Easter Sunday, we're joined by not one, but two religious leaders. As always, we want to hear from you, so if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out on air, then email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or you can tweet us at gbnews. This is the political correction. Reports of mass killings, rapes and torture continue to amass in Ukraine, with investigators uncovering more and more evidence of atrocities on a daily basis. Karim Khan QC, who's the first Briton to lead the International Criminal Court in The Hague, has said there are reasonable grounds to believe war crimes had been committed by Russian troops. Truth very often is the first casualty of war, said Mr. Khan, but he insisted that the truth always emerges in the end. Well, joining us now in the studio to decipher what constitutes a war crime and discuss whether Putin would be found guilty is human rights lawyer Mark Guthrie. Mark, thank you for joining us here this morning. I guess the first question that a lot of our viewers at home might be wondering is, what exactly does constitute a war crime?
There are three broad categories of war crimes. Strictly speaking, war crimes are grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of 1949, which are attacks on civilians, so killing or injuring civilians would be war crimes. But probably the highest and the one which has attracted a lot of attention recently is the question of genocide. A legal concept which was developed in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, a legal concept developed by jurists, in fact, from Lviv. And then you have crimes against humanity. So genocide, which is the specific intent to eliminate in whole or in part a national group. And then you have crimes against humanity, which is the systematic attack on civilians by killing, by rape, or by injury. So you have those three broad crimes.
And from what we're seeing in Ukraine, do you think that that threshold potentially has been reached?
Well, there's very much a strong case against Russia and Vladimir Putin to answer on the question of war crimes. There have been the reports, as you know, of attacks on civilians at Bucha, at Kramatorsk, bakeries being shelled on the outskirts of Kyiv, the attacks on Mariupol where civilians have died. So there is certainly a very strong case to answer, as the prosecutor at the ICC has said.
On the genocide point, Mark, Joe Biden obviously recently made the point that he felt that what was happening was genocide in Ukraine, and I think he defended that comment by saying that Putin is trying to destroy the idea of being Ukrainian. And I saw some pushback against that from people who said, well, technically, that's not what genocide is. It's about attempting to wipe out a particular national or ethnic group as a people rather than a nationality as such. I'd be interested in your take on that. What side do you fall down on in that debate?
Well, I think it's very significant that President Biden made that declaration. You may remember at the time of the Rwanda genocide, there was a great reluctance, certainly on the US side, to describe what was happening in Rwanda as genocide. And
Armenia as well. I think in the Armenian situation, I think our government has never called that a genocide before now.
No, and certainly not in Turkey. I mean, there are many instances. What happened in Namibia and with the Germans, with the Herero people, there are many instances of where it's been disputed whether there has been genocide. So it's significant that President Biden made that declaration. Others have been more hesitant. I can understand that hesitancy because it's a question of evidence, and probably of all the war crimes, genocide is the most difficult to prove because you have to show that specific intent. So what I would say is that the more atrocious the war is conducted, the more killings there are, the more any declarations which are made by Putin and Russia, the greater the evidence of genocide, and the greater the case to answer is on that. So I probably wouldn't want to be so definitive at this stage, but I would certainly say that
there could be a case.
There certainly could be a case. Let's put it that way.
Well, with the intervention now from the International Criminal Court, what happens next?
Well, what they're doing at the moment is undertaking a very important stage, and that's documenting the evidence and getting it together. The ICC prosecutor has sent a team, but also what's also happening in Ukraine is that the prosecutor general in Ukraine, she is also conducting her own investigation.
Mm-hmm.
So there is also a domestic element to the investigation of these war crimes, and ultimately, although the ICC will be involved, that will be complementary to the Ukrainian prosecutor and the Ukrainian courts. They also have jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute war crimes, and that's what the Ukrainian prosecutor general is doing at this very moment.
Like a lot of people with the International Criminal Court say effectively it's a mechanism for holding to account African dictators or certainly non-Western leaders.
Yeah.
If you look at the situation in Iraq, for example, 2003, the invasion there, which I think many people now believe was illegal, but the chances of ever seeing Blair or Bush in the, I mean, I know America has a particular problem with the ICC anyway, but the chances of ever seeing any Western leader really in the dock always seems to be very slim. I mean, do you think some of those criticisms are legitimate?
Well, you have to, leaders to be accountable for war crimes, you would have to hold them responsible on the basis of command responsibility. British political leaders are not the head of the armed forces here. We have a chief of the defence staff, so you have that difficulty in relation to certainly British political leaders. In relation to the criticism that's been made of the ICC that it's only gone after Africans, I think that obscures the fact that many African states are parties to the International Criminal Court. You've got countries like South Africa, Botswana, Kenya. Many of them, by contrast, the United States and also Russia, is not a party to the ICC. And the way that you strengthen the credibility of the ICC is to work towards universal membership of the ICC. And that, I think, is the answer.
Would you say that a good example of where the ICC worked best was in response to the war in the former Yugoslavia and the fact that a number of leaders ended up there?
ICC wasn't in existence when the war in Yugoslavia took place. The war crimes arising out of the conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina was the subject of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was established under a United Nations Security Council resolution in 1993. But also, the domestic courts in Bosnia-Herzegovina tried and continue to try war crimes arising out of that conflict. There are still...
At the ICC?
No, they are...
Still at the tribunal?
No, in the Bosnian-Herzegovina domestic courts, at this very moment, there are trials cases being investigated, and they continue to be prosecuted. So you had the tribunal, the ICTY in The Hague, trying the most... the top leaders, such as Slobodan Milosevic, Ratko Mladic, Radovan Karadzic. So the most serious cases went to The Hague, but also serious cases were tried and are being tried in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that's a similar example of where you have an international court trying war crimes alongside domestic courts, which may well be the case arising out of the war in Ukraine.
How difficult have investigators kind of found it, or are they finding it, to try and verify things like social media posts and videos? Because that must be a massive change compared to a decade or two ago.
Absolutely. And probably this is a conflict in which the opportunities for war crimes to be documented is greater than ever before. So obviously, if you are using videos made on your phone, there has to be a way of verifying them and ensuring that they are stored in a way that they ultimately will be admissible in court, and probably a considerable time in the future. So absolutely, those who are doing the investigating have to make sure that the evidence that they're receiving can be verified and that it's credible. Because clearly it's going to, already the Russians are saying this is fake news, and so it's likely that, it will come under the credibility will be questioned.
And yeah, I assume it means there's a huge wealth of potential evidence, though.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I think in Mariupol the Russians were confiscating people's phones because they were very worried about the ability of people to record what was going on.
Really interesting. Well, Mark Guthrie there, human rights lawyer, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Now, coming up after the break, we'll be joined in the studio again by broadcasting legend Alistair Stewart to look forward to his show just after Political Correction here on GB News. But as always, we want to hear from you, so do keep your views coming in, get involved. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @gbnews. But first, here's your latest weather.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, but to the point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. And as ever, loads of you getting in touch here. Michael saying, personally, I don't expect high standards from politicians and civil servants, so wasn't surprised at all by the hypocrisy.
And on the same theme, Partygate, Steve says, I do not believe a single person can 100% say they didn't bend the COVID laws. I'm an ex-nurse and was determined not to catch or pass on the virus. Inadvertently, I broke the rules 3 times, maybe more. All 3 were outside of my control.
We've got Mark here saying, what about the North East gym owner who's been fined £55,000 for opening his gym during lockdown and was providing support to people? Our own PM who made the rules broke them too and gets a £50 fine. How can that ever be fair or just?
And Chaz says, I think the public will show their disgust at the local elections with their feet. I'm not sure we'd know the difference because local elections always have a pretty low turnout anyway.
Very true. And we've got 2 polls here. First poll says, anyone who still criticises Boris gets on my nerves. And other poll says, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm more concerned with my bills than a bloke eating cake.
Neither of those were me, I can
For a change.
For a change, yeah.
And then we've got a couple in on Extinction Rebellion as well. Camilla saying, most people want to save the planet, but gluing yourselves to roads or anything will only achieve anger and shows no empathy for individuals.
And Stephen says, we're not in a position to just stop using gas and oil.
And then a good tongue-in-cheek one there from Fred, who says, I'd send all the Extinction Rebellion protesters to Rwanda, tying into the story earlier about migrants potentially being sent to Rwanda. But do keep your views coming in. You know where to send them, gbviews@gbnews.uk. But now I'm delighted to say we're joined in the studio by our very own Alistair Stewart to look ahead to his show at 12 p.m. Alistair, what are we discussing today?
What-oh? Well, we were contemplating putting an outside broadcast unit on Whitehall with the full expectation of 4 knights in shining armour cantering down, heading for Lambeth Palace or Canterbury to rid Boris of this turbulent priest. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has suggested that the Rwanda immigration plan doesn't measure up to what God would expect. He doesn't actually say it's ungodly, although that's the line that the newspapers have taken. But it is an intriguing intervention from so high up in the church, number 2 after the Queen in the Church of England. But also, as you will well know, he, alongside other senior bishops, sits in the House of Lords as well, and therefore has a say in our legislative process over all of this, and it's still got to be debated. So we'll be mulling over that. My two top guests at the beginning are Nigel Nelson, great guy, longest-serving political editor in Fleet Street from the Mirror Group, to take his view, and a very good friend of ours and of mine, Michael Portillo, will be joining us to mull that over. Michael's also doubly interesting because, as that poll you were referring to earlier on, that I think is in the Mail, shows cost of living crisis remains the real concern. Michael is a former Treasury Minister as well as Defence Secretary, so I'll be asking him a couple of questions about that and about the situation in Ukraine. Also being joined by Angela Knight, who way back when was a Tory MP and a junior minister, but ran UK Energy for a while, and Justine Birtles from Magpie.com about the cost of living. And my final guest is a lovely old friend of mine called George Pitcher. George used to be the business editor of The Observer newspaper, and dealt with some really appalling scandals, some that actually made P&O look fairly amateur weekend fodder. And he then went into PR and finally now, in this third phase of his life, has become a vicar.
Wow.
And I just thought it would be fascinating to sit down with someone like George, who's bright as a button, and say, OK, let's talk about morality in business, let's talk about morality in politics, and let's talk about the Archbishop of Canterbury intervening in one of the most sensitive issues on the political agenda, as all of those emails that you were both just reading out demonstrates.
Alistair, in your long and distinguished career, I mean, the idea of senior clergy interfering so directly in politics, is it anything really new? I mean,
no, it's not. No, and in fact,
in the early 80s, I was only a kid, but I remember Robert Runcie, and rights and faith in the city, and the Thatcher government very critical of the Thatcher.
Very critical of the Thatcher government, and interestingly, one of his successors, George Carey, then came out and said actually Thatcher gave the country its backbone back. So Canterbury has often been willing to have its say, and of course there was the Bishop of Durham as well, who came out against the government, and then Durham Cathedral was struck by lightning, and I think that your party then claimed that I think that God was on the side. No, but it's already on social media and elsewhere an intriguing debate, the degree to which you have people like Welby, who are very bright and lived a proper secular life, was in the oil industry before becoming a cleric, like my friend George Pitcher, occupying positions of that authority. It would be crazy if they didn't speak out. But when something is as contentious as immigration and Priti Patel's Rwanda plan, I just think it'll be interesting to hear from Nigel and Michael and others as to whether he's crossed the line with that. By saying it's ungodly, because that's a theological, philosophical, political judgment as much as anything. But no, you're absolutely right. The vicars have always been up for chipping in.
They used to call the Anglican Church the Tory party at prayer, didn't they? It's now the Lib Dem party at prayer, isn't it, realistically? Or the Greens, maybe?
Well,
there's very little conservative about the Anglican Church. In a small C sense, there's not much conservative about it now. They're all very woke and very right on.
Well, an awful lot of my friends, present company excluded, he underlines several times.
What's coming?
No. The thing I hear most from friends is that there's not very much conservative about the current Conservative Party either. I think the stuff that David Froster's been writing about, and I see his name is allegedly in the frame for the Wakefield by-election, which is intriguing. But this whole debate for what is a conservative in the 21st century on tax and on spend, on civil liberties and the rest of it, I think that's as vibrant a debate as well. So for Welby to come in specifically on immigration, fine, we'll have a debate around about that. But there is a fairly profound debate, I think, to be had still right now about what the Conservative Party actually stands for in 2022 going forward to the general election. But I reckon you need to have that debate about Labour as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, where are Labour on the economy? Where's the fresh thinking?
For a long time.
Absolutely. So all good, lively stuff.
It sounds like a great show coming up, and that's on at 12 o'clock.
12 till 2.
12 till 2. So you know what to do, people. Tune in. Don't go anywhere once Political Correction's finished, because you can have 2 hours on the couch with the wonderful Alistair Stewart. Now, coming up on the Political Correction, it's time for a special Easter edition of Common Ground. But first, here are your latest headlines.
It's 11:32. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. The Archbishop of Canterbury says government plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda cannot stand up to the judgment of God. In his Easter sermon at Canterbury Cathedral, Justin Welby says the decision does not match our values as a Christian country. However, Home Secretary Priti Patel says other countries will follow the UK's blueprint. Boris Johnson has addressed Ukrainians in his Easter message today. His statement comes after the Ministry of Defence said that Russia is still committed to ending Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic ambitions and asserting its own regional dominance. Yesterday, the Kremlin barred the Prime Minister and 12 other cabinet ministers from entering Russia. Speaking in Ukrainian, Mr. Johnson urged those in the country to be strong and have courage in your heart.
Those around the world facing fear of persecution, forced to celebrate their Saviour's rebirth in secret, and of course, the Christians of Ukraine, whether they're marking Easter today or its Orthodox equivalent later this month, for whom Christ's message of hope, the triumph of life over death and good over evil, will resonate this year perhaps more than any other. Будьте сильны и майте в сердце odvahu. Вisi, что вповайте на Господа.
And the Duke and Duchess of Sussex have commended the bravery of the Ukrainian team during the opening ceremony of the Invictus Games. Speaking at the event in The Hague, Meghan told the crowd, Slava Ukraini, meaning glory to Ukraine. The couple then kissed before Harry delivered an emotional speech, telling the Ukrainian competitors, we stand with you. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction, and loads of you getting in touch with us today on MSPs being able to get elected at 16. Mark says this is a ridiculous idea. The SNP is trying to radicalise young people in schools and universities to their way of thinking.
On immigration, Avril says those who criticise the government, be they clerics, opposition parties or charities, are so annoying. They find fault with everything but never come up with a viable alternative. Words cost nothing, but ideas could be helpful.
Exactly what you were saying earlier, Paul, when we were debating this.
Exactly that.
Hazel says perhaps the government could commit the people fleeing to the UK to train as truck drivers and to work in industries where we have staff shortages in return for board, lodging and pay. Turn a negative into a positive and give these young men a purpose. I think they're turning down a great labour force.
And on Partygate, Mike says, please get back to centre-right and away from Boris bashing Partygate. Nobody is interested.
We've had a few viewers, I think, who are quite interested in that one today, but thank you, Mike, regardless. And do keep getting in touch with us. Now, of course, today is Easter Sunday. And unfortunately, our very own Arlene Foster can't be with us this morning, but she has taken the time to send us all this Easter message.
So you're probably all wondering, where is Arlene Foster today? Well, the good people at GBNews have given me today off so I can spend Easter with my family at home in Northern Ireland. I do hope you all have a very happy Easter, however you're spending it, and I'll see you again next week.
There we go. Arlene will be back with us next week. Now, of course, every week in our regular feature, Common Ground, we discuss the issues and social ideas that bring our country together with leaders of all faiths. We're privileged to be joined on this Easter Sunday morning by Father Nadeem Nassar, who gave his Easter sermon just over an hour ago. Father, thank you for joining us. And what did you have to say in your sermon today?
Good morning. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Before I tell you what I said in my sermon, I heard that talking about when the church says something about current affairs, they call us, we are interfering. And this is the result of the Enlightenment that pushed the church out of the public arena. My friends, we are not interfering. We are being part of the society. And there is a huge difference between the two. And I want to say something to your colleagues and those who are interested. We have lost, as a church, the prophetic voice in the society. This is the result of the, if I may say, atheistic secularism that we live in. When we say our opinions, we are not
when it's ready, just drop it into the conversation.
We are being
and
part
just say,
of the debate. We are part of the society telling what we think. So when we say Christ is risen, God gave us through that resurrection the power to be the light in the world. So for the church to lose the prophetic voice is one thing, and for us to interfere in the political life is completely different. We are not interfering, we are being part of the society. What I said in my sermon today is that John reflected his new identity by saying the disciples that Jesus loved. Usually we are too busy with ourselves. We are too busy looking for things in our heads. But God calls us by name, as Jesus called Mary by her name and said, Mary, stop looking for the death. I am alive. It is time for the church to look for life in the society. And I know the debate is huge about this plan of Rwanda, but I say to Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Patel, well, before I say anything theological, I would ask them both, would you send your children to Rwanda for months or years for their papers to be looked at? If you find this plan good for your children and for yourselves, are you ready to go to Rwanda to wait for your papers to be handled? If you are ready to do that, if you are ready to send your children there, it's okay for me, and it's okay for the rest of us. So before we judge others, let's judge ourselves. We are the people of life. We are the people of the resurrection. We are the people of the presence of God here and now. So let us be pro-life rather than pro-doom and gloom. We have seen enough destruction around us. We have seen enough war around us. Look at the world. Many more millions of refugees are added every year in the world. Who is standing up? Our politicians? Our politicians are in cahoot to sell arms. More 800 million pounds of arms extra sale to Ukraine. Who benefited from that? The Ukrainian people? Well, I want to stand up against our politicians and challenging them. Yes, it is time for them to listen to what we have to say as the people of faith. There is nothing wrong with that. We are not interfering. We are being part of the society that believe in life, not in death and destruction.
Father, thank you so much for that very kind of impassioned contribution there. I suppose one question is, clearly it's a very holy day today. What was the sort of turnout like for your sermon today, and how are you going to spend the rest of your day celebrating?
Well, the church, thank God, it was full after, the corona crisis, and we are back to normal. We gave also the chalice today, and the people reacted very well. We talked about how we can fall and stand again, and because Jesus rose from the dead, it is okay for us to fall. It is okay for us to fail. Some people will panic and feel if I fail or if I fall, it means I am away from God. It's the contrary. God is there when we fall and when we fail. So it is for us to stand up and encourage the society to stand up. Our congregation has been wonderful, and our community has reacted to Easter in a beautiful way and encouragement. And we say to all those who lost their homes, lost their loved ones around the world, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in Africa, wherever they are, we stand before you. Christ is risen, and at the end, we are pro-life. We are the light in this world.
Brilliant. Father Nadeem Assar there joining us this morning on Easter Sunday for Common Ground. Thank you, Father, for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Now, this is a very holy month because, as well as Ramadan, Friday was also the start of Passover. And joining us to mark that is Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain from Maidenhead Synagogue. Good morning, Rabbi. Thank you for joining us this morning. I think one of the first things that you wanted to discuss was this kind of crossover of the three faiths.
To use a religious word, of Easter and Passover and Ramadan. Easter and Passover, to be honest, often do coincide, because it's very often thought that the Last Supper that Jesus celebrated with his disciples was in fact a Passover meal, because they were in Jerusalem for the Passover itself. But coinciding with Ramadan, that's unusual, because as some of your viewers will know, Ramadan, the Muslims used a lunar calendar, whereas you and I use a solar calendar for the days of the week, and therefore Ramadan, the lunar calendar slips 11 days every year, which is why Ramadan sort of revolves around the year over the course of about 10 or 11 years. And one day it'll be in the summer, another day in the spring, another day in the winter, and so forth. But this is one of those rare occasions where all three festivals occur at the same weekend, which is great. And it sort of begs the question of how well the religions actually get on outside of their church, mosque and synagogue. And there's sort of good news and bad news, isn't there? And I think when they're involved in territory, things seem to get a bit sticky. So there's like problems with Jews and Muslims over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem at this moment. There's problems between all the different sects over who has access to the Holy Sepulchre. And there's actually not just squabbles, but physical fights sometimes. But the good news is once you get away from the territory, then actually people get on really well, particularly in this country. And really one of the great religious developments of the last 50, 60 years is the flowering of interfaith relations. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, the local mosque in Maidenhead a couple of years back was doing some rebuilding, and would you believe it? It overran, and the builders didn't complete on time. And so the imam rang me up, he knew my number, knew my name, and said, look, we've got a problem, we can't hold a special event, can we use the synagogue building? So of course I said yes, but the fact that he even thought of holding an Islamic event in the synagogue, and I had no hesitation in saying yes, just epitomizes the actual harmony that actually goes on once we get away from the territorial problems.
And a wonderful sense of community, of course, as well. On that point about community, I know you wanted to discuss with us the sheer number of people in the UK who've offered to open their home to Ukrainian refugees.
Yes, it's another good news story, really, because, despite the cruelty that's going on over there, the compassion and the kindness that's happening here is really quite remarkable. It sort of restores your faith in human nature. And I've been quite active in organising hosts for the people who want to come over, the refugees. That's now happening, and there's more and more people coming over. And so we're moving on to the second stage, which is actually helping the hosts, because, it's a really big ask, isn't it, to put up someone for 6 months, particularly someone you don't know, and particularly someone who's traumatized. You know what it's like having the relatives over for Christmas just for 2 or 3 days. After a while, you're happy to say goodbye to them. So a complete stranger for 6 months is remarkable. And there's a lot of people who can't actually offer their homes or don't have the space, but they do want to help in other ways. And so we're organising support for the hosts and the refugees, such as people offering lifts or giving English lessons or taking the kids out for a day somewhere or giving legal advice or counselling. So all those support things, because what we really don't want to happen is that things go pear-shaped and the host and the refugees sort of fall apart and they're looking for new accommodation in 6 or 7 weeks. So we're trying to be as supportive as possible just to make sure that this works.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for your contribution on that point, because I know, as you say, hosting someone in your home it could be a challenge. It's a really wonderful thing to do, but there are other challenges, as you say, English lessons, transportation. So it's great to know that other members in the community have been getting involved, and thank you for your organisation there. I know the third story you wanted to talk about is on Elon Musk and Twitter.
Yes, I've sort of go on Twitter myself and sort of do a daily tweet. And Elon Musk gave the justification for his supposed takeover as he wanted to free it of controls. Well, freedom sounds great, but it's actually very dangerous. And anyone who's used Twitter will know it can be wonderful but horrible at the same time. And it can become misused by propaganda, whether it's by individuals or governments. There can be a lot of financial misadvice. There can be actual criminal activity and scams. There can be a lot of medical nonsense. So I'm actually not sure if an unregulated, completely free Twitter is very desirable. And I don't understand why we can't regulate the social media in the same way that we regulate television or we regulate newspapers. And people don't get depressed by reading the papers, or they don't get suicidal by watching television, whereas we know that does happen with social media. And I think it's not good enough. And although I'm not a shareholder, I would certainly vote against the Elon Musk proposal, because I actually think you do need some safety mechanisms to stop this sort of free for all, which is actually a harm for all.
Yeah, and I think on that point, that's why the government is introducing this new online harms bill to try and sort of mitigate some of the dangers of social media that you rightly highlighted there. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain, for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and indeed week.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Time now for a look at the biggest sporting events taking place this weekend, and I'm pleased to say we're joined in the studio now by our very own sports broadcaster and writer, Aidan McGee. Aidan, thank you so much for coming in.
Don't forget the writer, I love that.
Yeah, obviously, it has to go in there too.
I've still got the QPR column in the programme, so I'm still a writer.
There we go.
No one reads that, though.
No, yeah, true, yeah.
Quiet weekend for sport, isn't it?
Yeah, big time. I mean, we had City and Liverpool yesterday, so they're both teams are involved in this series of 4 games, which enveloped the Champions League, the FA Cup, which we saw yesterday, and the Premier League, and it's going to go a long way to defining their seasons. And City and Liverpool could still meet in the Champions League final. Mm-hmm. They're locked in a battle for the Premier League title as well. It's going to be between those two. Nobody else is really involved. And the FA Cup was yesterday, and they tore out of the traps yesterday. They went 3-0 up. Zach Steffen, the Manchester City goalkeeper, made a blunder on his debut. His big night out. And he blew it just on the line. Did you see the goal? Did you see the?
I did.
Yeah,
they were absolutely dominant, weren't they?
Certainly wasn't. I mean, they came out. I mean, there was.
It was a decent comeback though in the end, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. Yeah, they fought back. I mean, there was quite an unsavoury incident before the game actually, with the minute silence with booing. We spoke about these minute silences. I mean, I think it was justified yesterday actually, but a lot of the time, this is you open yourself up to trouble when you have too many of them really. But they had one yesterday. It was justified, and there was some booing. City released a statement at half-time saying that they condemned the actions of a minority of supporters, but as we say, it wasn't a minority. So that kind of put a little bit of a, I don't know, it tarnished it slightly, but they did come back.
Now to have minute silence. I mean, certainly in days gone, in years gone by, minute silence was the way that you did it. But often it's applause now, which I'd say I don't like. I don't like minutes applause. I don't think it carries the same weight as minute silence. But when things like that happened yesterday, you can probably see the case.
To be fair, there's been no history of City. This is why I think it may have been a misunderstanding. Now, we were talking about it earlier with Stephen and Anne. Just because you're not sure what a minute of silence is about, it doesn't necessarily mean you should boo it just in case it's something you don't like. Just keep quiet if you've got nothing to say. But nonetheless, it was, it's, when you have so many as well, and when you have, I think the applause I don't actually mind, because at least you can drown out any booing. But as you say, it doesn't really have the effect that, or if you're trying to make a statement, it's difficult to have that effect. But nonetheless, anyway, City came back second half. They made 5 changes before the game as well, so it wasn't completely representative of what they're trying to do. Their priorities clearly the league, and Champions League the main one. That's Champions League the one they haven't got in the kind of 14 years since they got taken over. And we got Chelsea against Crystal Palace today as well. Interesting tale there, because Conor Gallagher has been he's been Palace's best player this season. He's in England squad, but he's a Chelsea player, and he's been on loan from Chelsea to Crystal Palace, and he's not allowed to play against the team. He's very disappointed. And Thomas Tuchel, who I think has shown some tremendous leadership in the last 6 weeks or so since Chelsea were engulfed by the implications of the war.
They were
in
unlucky
Ukraine.
against Madrid. They nearly pulled it.
They were absolutely. But Thomas Tuchel took the trouble to ring Conor Gallagher and say to him, "Listen, the rules are the rules. You can't play against us, but your time will come. Don't worry about that."
Do you agree with me that, I mean, when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, the FA Cup was the big thing. It was so prestigious. Not only the whole country, but much of the world watched it as well. And it was most players, that was the thing they wanted to win. They wanted to get to Wembley on cup final.
Oh, without doubt.
Now it's almost like an afterthought. It's all about the Champions League. It's
about money. It was always about money. The prize money in the 80s for the FA Cup was comparable to what you'd win for the league, because there was no all-encompassing jumbo TV deal involved. So it was worthwhile winning the FA Cup, and there was the prestige with it as well. It was a proper English competition. If you increase the prize money for the FA Cup tomorrow, and you you added to it a Champions League place, you'd soon see the prestige of the FA Cup rise overnight. It's about money, but it was always about money.
Yeah, I think it's sad in many respects, because now, I mean, a lot of the top teams just put out their second string for FA Cup matches.
Talking to a colleague of mine earlier on, he remained nameless, but he said if Man City can't be bothered to play their full team, then I can't be bothered to watch.
I mean, it was great back in the day, because, I mean, even small teams like QPR could get to the final in 1982.
We were robbed.
Tottenham. I mean, I remember that quite well.
In the replay, I mean, how Gary McAllister's goal didn't stand, I'll never know.
We could talk about that.
I can't. I can't, unfortunately.
Way to wind him up right before the end day. And quickly, other sports, what else is going on this weekend outside the world of football?
We've got the World Snooker Championships are underway. Now, the talk is about Ronnie O'Sullivan at the Crucible. Can he get his 7th? I think it's his 7th time. Might be his 8th. I think it's his 7th. But he's waited a long time to try and match Stephen Hendry, who started winning titles in the late 80s, early 90s. He kind of usurped Steve Davis. It's always been understood that O'Sullivan's probably the greatest player in terms of natural ability to live, and he's done it in terms of world titles as well. But beyond that, to get that overall undisputed title as a bit like tennis. We have the race to the slams, which we've discussed many times. To get that sort of status as the undisputed number one, he's got to really at least equal Stephen Hendry and go past him. He's got a chance to do that. I think he's underway today in the first round, so we'll see how that goes there. Always quite big. But again, back in the 80s, much bigger sport, snooker, than it is now.
I remember sitting up for the Dennis Taylor, Steve Davis, 1985.
22 million viewers.
And it finished about 1 o'clock in the morning, I think, and everybody had work the next day.
I know.
I think it was on the Sunday.
Remember he won, and it was the queue up in the air like that, wasn't it?
It was massive back in the day, wasn't it?
It was, and he had these glasses upside down.
Yeah.
But it's not quite the cachet it had back then, but still an important event.
But to be fair, they had characters back then, didn't they? The likes of Jimmy Wyatt, and then maybe not so much Steve Davis, he was before him, but certainly Alex Higgins and players. But now they're almost robots, aren't they? Apart from O'Sullivan, maybe, who is
O'Sullivan's not. He comes and goes. He's had issues off the away from the table as well, which he's discussed at length. But I do think this could be his year, and also he's a veteran, but he's not particularly old. He's only in his early 50s, I think. So around about 50,
maybe 40s even.
Yeah. So and he came from a troubled background as well, so he deserves a lot of credit. And if he can do it this year, it'll be fantastic.
It's a big sport weekend.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on this Easter Sunday. Political Correction is here every Sunday morning from 10 o'clock, and we'll be back next week. Up next, though, is the wonderful Alastair Stewart. So make sure you don't go anywhere and enjoy the rest of your Easter.
Coming up today at 6 p.m.
Welcome to a very special GB News Easter programme. We are invited during this short time to enter into the passion, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's an invitation to take part in the most important part of the Christian life. Happy Easter. Alleluia.
The Meaning of Easter with Calvin Robinson today at 6 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.